Hello everyone. Today we are going to both England and Australia. So sit back as we look at the extraordinary case of Thomas Leigh. Thomas Leigh was born in the beautiful spa city of Bath in England on the 29th of October 1880. His father was a butler working for some of the greatest houses of the Victorian era, but he died in 1882, leaving behind Thomas's mother named Elizabeth and their 4 children. After her husband's death, Elizabeth found life hard in England, so decided to take her family to live in Australia. During the 1870s and 1880s, the Australian economy was growing quickly, and many people from Europe sailed there to take advantage of the many employment opportunities available. Elizabeth thought that Australia would be a better place to bring up her young family, so together with their 4 children sailed to Sydney, arriving in 1886. The family settled in Sydney, and Thomas attended the Crown Street Public School in the Surrey Hills area of the city, but he had to leave when he was 10 years old to help his mother in her grocery store. A couple of years later, he went to work on a dairy farm in Windsor, which in the 19th century was a small town about 50 kilometres northwest of Sydney. Later, he sold newspapers and ran messages, but Thomas had greater ambitions in life. He was very interested in politics and enjoyed reading the political articles in the newspapers he was delivering. And when he had time, he would sit in the gallery at Parliament House to hear the political debates that took place. He thought that politicians were powerful, influential people, and decided that he wanted to join their ranks. Believing that a good politician had to be a good orator, in 1896 Thomas joined the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts, where he began to develop his debating skills. At this time he was working as a junior clerk in a small local solicitor's office in Sydney and was going to night school to study law. On the 16th of June 1898, Thomas married Emily Lewis Stone, the daughter of a wealthy Somerset doctor. She had come to Australia the previous year following the death of her father, and the newlyweds lived with Emily's mother. 3 years later, seeking better employment opportunities, Thomas took a job at a much larger law firm in the centre of Sydney. By 1906, Emily had given birth to 3 sons, and Thomas realised that the inner city offered few opportunities for an aspiring young politician, so he moved with his family to the developing southern Sydney suburb of Hurstville. There were 3 requirements for anyone with political ambition at the time in Hurstville. They had to be churchgoers, family men, and a supporter of the temperance movement, which was a local movement against the consumption of alcohol. Within 5 months he was elected to the local council. He served on council committees dealing with parks and gardens, rates and levies, bylaws and street maintenance. He was also involved in the local Ratepayers Association. His fight against the so-called menace of alcohol was so forceful that he became known as Lemonade Leigh. During this time he continued with his studies, and in 1914 he became a solicitor, which gave him more credibility in the political arena. But he found it difficult trying to move up the political ladder, and after losing in the election to become the mayor of Hurstville, Thomas decided to turn his attention to state politics. He was elected to state parliament in 1917 as the National Party member for Hurstville. However, he had no intentions of passing legislation to ban alcohol, and was allegedly taking bribes from people lobbying on behalf of the brewing companies. He joined the Progressive Party in 1919 when it split from the Nationals, and in 1920 he was elected the Progressive member for St George. In 1922, when the Progressive Party rejoined with the National Party, Thomas became the Minister of Justice. He believed strongly in the death penalty and rejected the 1924 appeal of Edward Williams, a poor music teacher condemned to death for murdering his 3 daughters, despite pleas from the public and evidence that Williams was insane. The case damaged his political career in New South Wales, but Thomas still had a burning desire to be the Prime Minister of Australia, and resigned his state seat to stand for the federal government seat of Barton in 1925. During the campaign, Thomas's opponent, named Fred MacDonald, alleged that Thomas had tried to bribe him to withdraw from the election. Thomas won the election anyway, but Mr. MacDonald disputed the result and sought to have the election declared void in the Court of Disputed Returns. On the 15th of April 1926, Mr. MacDonald mysteriously disappeared. His body was never found, but the police found a suicide note which they thought had been forged. Thomas was also considered to be a shady operator in his private business dealings, and in 1926, one of his businesses, called SOS Prickly Pear Poisons Limited, failed, resulting in all the investors losing their money. Keith Gredor was leading a group of out-of-pocket shareholders trying to get compensation from Thomas. Mr. Gredor, however, suddenly fell off a ship and drowned. The following year, the legal firm that Thomas had established was facing many allegations of irregular dealings, with one accuser being his legal partner named Hyman Goldstein. In September 1928, Hyman Goldstein was found dead at the bottom of a cliff. Suspicion about Thomas Leigh was mounting, and rumours about his dishonesty saw him lose his parliamentary seat in the 1928 federal elections. Thomas, now 48 years old, decided to leave politics, and together with his long-term mistress named Maggie Brooke, returned to England. Maggie was a widow whose husband had served as a magistrate and also died in mysterious circumstances. It was now the late 1920s, and London was moving forward after the ending of the First World War 10 years earlier. The country had just given women the right to vote on equal terms as men, and George V was king. Thomas arrived back to the country of his birth with enough money to buy a property and start taking advantages of the abundance of business opportunities available. But Thomas was a shady character who preferred to cut corners and was quite happy to make money illegally whenever he could. He promoted the unrealised £1 million sweepstake for the 1931 horse race for Derby and engaged in dubious real estate dealings. During the Second World War, Thomas ran a black market operation for which he was arrested and convicted. After the war, Thomas decided to convert his large house in the fashionable West London borough of Kensington into flats. While the work was taking place, his partner Maggie moved into a boarding house in Wimbledon, which was about 7 miles away. One of the other boarders staying there was a 35-year-old man named John Muddy. He worked as a barman at the Reigate Hill Hotel. Maggie and John would occasionally exchange polite greetings if they ever met each other on the stairs. But despite Maggie being 25 years older than the young barman, Thomas was convinced that they were having an affair. Thomas decided that he had to get rid of John Muddy, so recruited John William Buckingham and Lawrence John Smith to help him in his plan to abduct, kill and dispose of the young barman, who he suspected of having an affair with his long-term mistress. The two men were contractors working on the conversion of his house into flats. Thomas told them that John Muddy was an evil man who had seduced his girlfriend and was now trying to blackmail her. Thomas had a plan. In late November 1946, he invited John Muddy to his Kensington home on the pretense that he was having a party and he needed him to run the bar, for which Thomas would pay him. When John arrived, the men threw a rug over his head, sat him in a chair and tied a clothesline around his arms, legs and body so he could not escape. At some time after, the innocent barman was strangled. On the 30th of November 1946, a local dog walker found John Muddy's body in a chalk pit on Waldingham Common in Surrey, 30 miles away from Thomas's home. The police investigation team arrived at the scene and the pathologist ascertained that the man had died from asphyxiation. It was clear that there was no mud on the deceased's shoes and that the crime had been committed elsewhere and the body brought to the scene. Detective Superintendent Fred Shrewbridge undertook the initial inquiries. It was easy to identify the victim as the deceased's identification card was still in his wallet. The police wasted no time in visiting the boarding house in Wimbledon, where the landlady, Mrs. Evans, confirmed that Muddy had been introduced there to a Maggie Brooke the director of a property company, during a chance meeting when they met on the stairs. The news of the murder was covered by all the major newspapers, and on reading the article in one of them, John Buckingham went to Scotland Yard to confess. He did not confess to murder. He told the investigation team that he had been paid £200 by Thomas Leigh to kidnap Muddy. He said that they lured Muddy to Thomas's house, where he and an accomplice, Lawrence Smith, waited for him. He said, "There was no fight or struggle, we just shut the door on him. Thomas paid the money and we left as fast as we could." The police contacted Lawrence Smith, who confirmed his accomplice's story, but said that when Muddy entered the house, Buckingham was waiting for him, holding a rug, while he held a clothesline. Smith said, "We kidnapped him by throwing the rug over his head, and my job was to tie the clothesline around his arms, legs and body so that he could not escape, but leaving the rug loose enough so that he could breathe." He said that they had left Muddy in a chair with a gag around his mouth. The police then interviewed Thomas, who of course denied any involvement in the crime. The police got a breakthrough when they discovered that Lawrence Smith had hired a car, and he was identified by a witness who saw him at the chalk pit. No witness, however, could identify John Buckingham as being there. Lawrence Smith and Thomas Leigh were charged with murder. On the 19th of March 1947, their trial started at the Old Bailey in London. The trial caused a sensation because the murder was one of the earliest to involve a hitman, and the mastermind behind it was a former Australian politician. The defence tried to offer the case that this could have been suicide, and there was much argument about the noose found around the victim's neck. The prosecution were able to present enough evidence to quash that theory, and both defendants were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The Lord Chief Justice of England, Lord Goddard, described Thomas Leigh as a very wicked man. Thomas had arranged the death of John Muddy, a barman who he deludedly believed to be Maggie Brooks' lover. 3 days before the Australian ex-Minister of Justice was due to hang for the Chalk Pit murder, his sentence was commuted and he was committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum in Berkshire. Lawrence Smith had his sentence commuted to life in prison. Thomas Leigh died in Broadmoor of a brain hemorrhage on the 24th of July 1947. He always professed his innocence to his part in the murder of John Muddy and all the crimes he was associated with. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening to another sad and tragic case. As usual, please leave any comments that you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case.